Welcome to One Monstrous Moment, You're the Dragon Edition. And for those of you who don't know what One Monstrous Moment is, remember back before Avengers Infinity War came out where you had a lot of the Marvel fans who made a series of analytical videos that talks about one particular scene from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, talk about why it's so great, called One Marvelous Moment? Well, One Monstrous Moment is basically exactly that, but with giant monster media. That was started by YouTuber the Omni, who has made One Monstrous Moment a special event pending on the release of any new Kaiju-related media. In this case, with the release of Godzilla X Kong: The New Empire, along with it being both the Year of the Dragon and Godzilla's 70th anniversary, I figured, why not join in? And so, for my One Monstrous Moment Year of the Dragon edition, I decided to talk about the Chimera's death scene from the 90s mecha anime The Big O, and why not only do I think it's a really tragic kaiju death, but an episode that I'm surprised managed to get dubbed in a retrospective kind of sense. And why I bring this up, let's go back to the late 90s, early 2000s, and anime getting dubbed around this time period was a very different kind of ball game in that sense, where depending on the company, most anime that got dubbed in America were heavily edited to either be more family-friendly or more Americanized. And the type of changes that were made to most anime that were aimed at the family-friendly audience included the change of characters' names, violent content, sexual content, and so on and so forth, with 4Kids Entertainment being the biggest offender of the bunch. Sure, you technically had Funimation still around at this point in time, but I think most of the anime they dubbed either premiered on more mature blocks or networks, unless if it was Dragon Ball Z, considering that was the flagship anime that played on Toonami during the early 2000s. But anywho, before I go any further, I would like to take this time to talk about Sailor Moon. And when I mean Sailor Moon, I mean the original Deke Cloverway dub. You know, the really infamous English dub of Sailor Moon that made so many changes. And if you thought having characters' names being changed around from being Japanese to be more Americanized was the worst thing that happened, that was just the start of it. Everything from making Sailor Uranus and Sailor Neptune go from being lesbians to being cousins, making characters such as Zoisite and Fishicite go from being men to women. Then, of course, you had a character like Zirconia, who was typically a woman that was now changed to a man who, strangely enough, sounded like Fozzie Bear on crack. Not even dubbing certain episodes because of either violent content or sexual content, to also not dubbing the 5th and final season. You know, that English dub. And a couple episodes I would like to talk about before I go any further are episodes 42, 45, and 46. Starting with 42, because prior to this episode, the way the original Sailor Moon first season was structured, you had the first 7 episodes where it turned out Usagi, or Serena as she was called in the original English dub, discovering her past life as a princess that fought the forces of evil and must take up the mantle of Sailor Moon to continue the fight against the forces of evil, while also learning how to use her newfound powers. But then between episode 8 up to episode 25, there was this formula where Serena would encounter a classmate who would turn out to be a new incarnation of one of her Sailor Scouts. Said classmate would then embrace their old identity while trying to learn how to use their newfound powers. Then you get to episode 33, where we get introduced to Sailor Venus. And up to this point, she's apparently an already pre-established character that already knew about her past and had been fighting the forces of evil for some time. Now, as for episode 42, in terms of why I think it's very significant, within the context of the original season, episode 42 was very significant because it did provide a lot of backstory for Sailor Venus in terms of when she discovered she was a reincarnation of a Sailor Scout, and we also discovered what she was doing prior to the events of the first season, where it turned out she was in Europe for some time battling the forces of evil while taking up the vigilante persona of Sailor V, while meeting 2 individuals that take the form of some schmuck and a police officer who she befriended. And near the end of the episode, she goes into a warehouse, an explosion occurs, and you have the police officer and Schmuck presuming she had died in the explosion, but in reality, Sailor Venus, or Sailor V, was merely injured, and they just presumed she had died in the explosion, and at that point, Sailor V simply decided to fake her own death and moved back to Japan in order to protect her friends. Now, the main reason why this episode was banned or never got dubbed in the first place mainly had to do with the violent content near the end of the episode, but I also think that maybe Sailor V faking her own death to protect her friends in Europe from the forces of evil might have also been a contributing factor in the episode getting banned in the first place. Given that, remember, Deke was trying to make this show aimed at a family-friendly audience, more specifically younger girls. And then you get to episodes 45 and 46, which is really significant because these two episodes aren't just any regular episodes, because they're the two final episodes of season 1, and they never got dubbed into English, at least not properly, because supposedly Deke decided to edit the two episodes together, which resulted in a lot of content getting removed from the two-part finale. Because in episode 45, we have the Sailor Guardians battling this group of monsters, and within the Japanese version, each of the Sailor Scouts get killed by each of the monsters as they fight them. But in the original Deke dub, they were merely captured by the enemy. Moving on, Deke would only dub season 2, while seasons 3 and 4 would be dubbed by Cloverway, resulting in the original English dub of Sailor Moon. Fast forward to 2014, where Viz Media would get the license to Sailor Moon and decided to redub the entire series from start to finish. And everything was right with the world. Characters were now addressing each other using their Japanese names. Sailor Uranus and Sailor Neptune were lesbians again. Zoe's Eye and Fish's Eye were men. Zirconia was now a woman again, who had the voice of Rita Repulsa, just without the ham. The 5th and final season got an English dub. And with that out of the way, I know what you're thinking. What does Sailor Moon have to do with the Big O, other than the fact that both of them played on Cartoon Network's Toonami block? They have nothing in common. And yeah, that's exactly it. They have nothing in common. But the point I'm trying to make with the original dub of Sailor Moon was that back during these days of English dubs that premiered on kids networks such as Cartoon Network's Toonami block, it was a very common practice for a lot of these anime to get heavily edited for one reason or another. Now, as for the Big O, on the other hand, for those of you who don't know what the Big O is, it was a anime that combined classic noir with diesel punk sci-fi and mixed them together, that was heavily inspired by the likes of Batman the Animated Series, James Bond, and Giant Robo mixed together. And for the first season, it was by definition a episodic series where you would have Roger Smith and friends get some kind of case they would investigate, they encounter the villain of the week, who would unleash a giant robot referred to as a Megadeus to destroy Paradigm City. And Roger Smith would call upon his Megadeus, the Big O, to pilot and fight against the enemy Megadeus. But once in a while, he did fight giant monsters, and the giant monster I would like to focus on would be that of the Chimera from episode 8, Missing Cat. And why not only do I think this is maybe one of the most tragic kaiju to exist, but why I think this episode in general was maybe the most shocking episode that I'm surprised it even got dubbed at all because of the way it ends. But in order to understand the ending, we have to break down the entire episode from start to finish. So the episode begins with this really bizarre murder of a billionaire who happened to be killed by her own golden retriever, which seamlessly mutated into some kind of monstrosity. Fast forward sometime later, we see one of the main characters, that of Dorothy, an android, who stumble upon a kitten and makes a very shocked expression and proceeds to take the kitten home. And for several minutes of the episode, we do see her bonding with said kitten, to the dismay of Roger Smith. However, the owners of the kitten soon shown up demanding to get the kitten back, with Dorothy refusing to hand the cat over to them. Then moments later, this mad scientist shows up, kidnaps both Dorothy and the cat, shooting down the owners in the process and taking them away. After surviving the shootout and placing the dead bodies of the kitten's owners next to each other, Roger Smith, out of pure anger, decides to go on a rescue mission in search of a man named Eugene Grant, an alchemist that researched artificial proteins. And if you're confused by what I mean by this, Eugene Grant is basically Shal Tucker from Fullmetal Alchemist before Shal Tucker even existed. And if you're someone who's familiar with Shal Tucker from Fullmetal Alchemist, you can kind of see where this story is going. But anywho, along the way, he meets up with the reoccurring femme fatale Angel, who informs him that the kitten is not a kitten, but in fact a young boy named Roy, who was experimented on by Eugene. Because earlier in the episode, it's established that cats and dogs are nearly extinct. And as Roger Smith put it, they're worth more than you and I. I doubt someone would even abandon one. Which also leads to a few more revelations, being that the owners of the kitten are really Roy's parents, and Dorothy knew he was a human the entire time. And as the episode progressed, we see that Roger Smith and Angel enter this room housing a really gigantic creature that Eugene refers to as the Chimera, which results in Roger Smith calling upon Big O to pilot and fight the Chimera. And as Roger Smith is about to deliver the final punch, Dorothy screams out for Roger not to destroy the Chimera because the Chimera is in fact the cat. And as Eugene commands the Chimera to finish off Big O once and for all, Dorothy puts her arms out in a living embrace, calling out to Puro, as the cat's been called throughout this whole episode, which results in Puro killing Eugene. And in his own unique way, he says farewell to Dorothy before walking into this burning building in order to commit suicide. And why I find the Chimera's death here to be so tragic and shocking. First off, let's take a deep dive into why the Chimera is a very tragic kaiju. Because it started life out as a boy named Roy, who was turned into a cat by Eugene. And during his time as a cat, now called Puro by Dorothy, both of his parents get shot by Eugene, with Puro only witnessing the death of his mother, which is literally the last time he'll ever see her. And then Eugene proceeds to take Puro at this point and transforms him into a Chimera, a kaiju that, much like Biolate from Godzilla vs. Biolate, is this abomination of nature that was created through the abuse of science and technology that was never asked to be created in the first place. In what little time the Chimera existed, the only thing he knew was pain and suffering, because not only did he receive several injuries from Roger Smith piloting Big O, with one case being a broken shoulder and arm, he also has a lot of internal suffering, because he realizes that on top of his parents being dead, there's no going back. The process is irreversible. So at this point, Roy, now a giant monster, has two choices. He can either choose to live out the rest of his life as a creature that can't be human again, or take what little humanity he has left and joins his parents, resulting in what I think is the most tragic kaiju death there is. Because I've seen my fair share of sad giant monster deaths over the years, with such examples being Godzilla's death from Godzilla vs. Destroyer, Kong's death from the Peter Jackson remake, the Elemental's death from Hellboy 2 The Golden Army, to the multitude of Mothra deaths seen in various Godzilla properties, with her most tragic death in my opinion being from the first Rebirth of Mothra movie. However, there is a very big difference between all of those deaths and the Chimera's death. With all the other giant monster deaths that I just mentioned, they either died as a result of battle, no matter if they died from their own wounds or they sacrificed themselves to protect another monster, or in some cases, with Godzilla's death from Godzilla vs. Destroyer, he's dying from a condition he has no control over. With the Chimera, on the other hand, this was a human child who decided to commit suicide of his own free will, and that's why I think this is perhaps the most tragic kaiju death seen in any piece of media. From an episode that I'm surprised even got dubbed in the first place, because like I mentioned with a couple episodes of Sailor Moon, this was aired during a time period where a lot of these studios were heavily editing these programs to be more family friendly, yet here's a program that also premiered on Toonami that managed to not get edited in any shape or form. And I know what you're thinking, but the Big O was dubbed by Bandai Entertainment, not DeK or 4Kids Entertainment, which is true, but even Bandai Entertainment on occasion did edit certain animes to be a bit more family friendly, with one such example being The Vision of Escaflowne, because on top of having 10 minutes worth of material not getting dubbed into English, there were also certain scenes where they had to edit some lines of dialogue, because there was one example where the main character, who happens to be a 14-year-old girl, is seen drinking some alcohol, but in the original English dub, it was changed so that she was drinking some juice instead. Kind of like a certain episode of the original DeK Cloverway Sailor Moon dub. But, much like Sailor Moon, The Vision of Escaflowne also got redubbed by Funimation, where those 10 minutes of footage was added back to the series and everything was back to normal. And sorry for the side tangent there, but anywho. And the last aspect of this particular scene that I want to bring up is that it's a good example of visual storytelling, in that the golden rule of any visual medium, no matter if it's a movie, television show, animated show, comic book, or graphic novel, the golden rule is always show, don't tell, because you should be able to understand what's going on through the visuals. And when you do watch this particular scene in question, you understand the situation immediately because of everything that occurred earlier in the episode. So there is no need for characters to speak dialogue or Roger Smith to have some internal monologue about what's transpiring, because there's no need. You understand the situation through the visuals alone. And there you have it. There's my one monstrous moment, Year of the Dragon edition. Not sure if I did this whole analysis thing right, but thank you and see you later.